Welcome to the debate. When you look at a grand theatrical performance, you don't really see the sweat or the trapdoors or, the raw schematics that keep the whole show from collapsing.
Yeah, you just see the actors hitting their marks under perfect lighting.
Exactly. It's a highly curated surface. So today we are looking at the professional equivalent of that hidden rigging, a framework from our source material known as the Living Professional Record, or the LPR.
Right, and the material gives us this very rigid, honestly almost aggressive definition of what the LPR is supposed to be, mostly by giving us an exhaustive list of what it is not.
Yes, the text states it point blank. It says the living professional record is not a resume. It is not a public profile. It is not a portfolio.
hmm
It is not a credential wallet. It is not a personal brand. It is not a brag file. It is not an employer-owned talent file. And, crucially, it is not a surveillance system.
I mean, that is a massive litany of disavows.
It is. But those distinctions really matter. The doctrine insists that if you mistake the LPR for literally any of those things, you will build the wrong system entirely. The LPR is designed strictly as this private source layer beneath your professional surfaces.
Right, so it sits underneath all the public stuff.
Exactly. It exists so that when you do generate a public output, what the material calls a rendering, like, say, a resume or an interview answer, that output remains completely accountable to evidence, context, claims, privacy boundaries, witnesses, and AI use. And so my position today is that this absolute architectural separation successfully insulates your professional record. It stops it from becoming just another superficial branding tool or, a creepy surveillance file. It prioritizes truth over appearance.
Well, look, I question whether that boundary actually holds up in practice. I mean, if you have to issue an 8-point denial explicitly declaring that a system is not a brag file and not a personal brand and not a surveillance system, you have to examine the actual mechanics of what it does.
Sure.
And I argue that because the LPR demands this exhaustive tracking of granular operational data like every judgment call, every mistake, every witness, it inevitably functions as a self-surveillance dossier. And honestly, the ultimate branding engine. It just blurs those lines one layer deeper out of public view.
Okay, well, let's break down those mechanics then, starting with how the LPR actually handles evidence. Because if you're used to just, updating a LinkedIn profile once a year, the LPR architecture sounds totally alien.
Oh, completely alien.
Right. It's built on 3 core components: an evidence vault, a context layer, and a claim map.
And to a lot of people, those just sound like capitalized corporate buzzwords.
Fair enough. Let's apply the ELI5 principle here. Explain it like I'm 5. Think of the evidence vault as just the raw receipts. The emails, the project dashboards, the actual code you pushed, the budget spreadsheets, it's just raw material.
Okay.
But raw material doesn't mean anything without context. So you have the context layer. This is where you explain the environment around that evidence. Like, I hit these metrics, but I did it after half my team was laid off. And then finally, the claim map connects the receipts and the context to a specific professional capability, allowing you to confidently say, I can do more with less.
So you're essentially describing version control for a human being.
Yes, that is a brilliant way to look at it. It is like GitHub for your career. Because the code repository, the commits, the rollbacks, the messy merge conflicts, that isn't the polished app the end user downloads, right?
Right.
The repository is the source layer. The app is the rendering. If you don't keep the repository exact and exhaustive, the app eventually breaks.
Okay, I like the GitHub analogy much better than comparing it to like a financial ledger, because GitHub admits that the process is messy. But let's look at the friction involved here. Because if you are listening to this right now on your commute or walking your dog, you are probably thinking, I can barely remember to update my timesheet on Friday afternoons, let alone map the ethical boundaries of my Tuesday morning strategy meeting.
Well, it's a different kind of tracking.
But the material explicitly instructs the worker to record the before condition, the after condition, the constraints, and get this, what a reader might misunderstand.
And that last part is so crucial for preserving truth.
But think about the cognitive architecture of that requirement. The moment you are documenting your work, while simultaneously anticipating how a hypothetical audience might misinterpret it, you are no longer maintaining a neutral source layer. You are packaging, you are rendering.
I don't think that's true.
It is. The burden of maintaining this quote-unquote living record, updating it after every project, every feedback session, every AI use, it collapses the boundary. The source layer is so demanding it becomes the primary focus of your professional life.
I completely disagree, and here's why. Anticipating misinterpretation is exactly how you govern truth in a highly complex environment. Let's put a concrete scenario to this. Imagine an operations manager who inherits a massive software rollout that has already been botched by the previous team.
Okay, a total nightmare scenario.
Exactly. It's over budget, morale is non-existent, half the vendors quit. Now fast forward 2 years. The operations manager saved the project, but it only achieved 80% of its original wildly unrealistic goals. If she just uses a traditional resume, a pure rendering layer, she writes a generic bullet point, right? Managed enterprise software rollout, achieving 80% adoption.
Which makes her look totally mediocre to an algorithm.
Yes! The generic rendering erases the blood, the sweat, and the context. But if she is using an LPR, her context layer captured the reality. It documented the constraint that the project was inherited mid-failure. It documented the severely cut budget.
Right.
By recording those constraints in the source layer, when she goes to render an interview answer later, she isn't forced to lie or look mediocre. She can render the exact truth. Rescued and stabilized a failing, under-resourced enterprise rollout, bringing it to 80% adoption under severe budget constraints. The LPR protects her from being erased by generic corporate speak.
I don't disagree that it creates a stronger, more accurate interview answer. That makes sense. But listen to what you just said. She curates the constraints so that she can generate a powerful narrative for an interviewer. How is that not personal branding?
Because it's rooted in objective evidence.
But the material is absolutely adamant that the LPR is not a brag file or a personal brand. It insists a brag file simply collects accomplishments. But curating your raw receipts into perfectly contextualized narratives to impress a hiring manager is the literal definition of personal branding. You're just doing it with an obsessively detailed spreadsheet instead of, an Instagram account.
You're making it sound like a marketing gimmick, but let's look at the actual mechanics that prevent it from being a brag file. The LPR governs claims, it doesn't just collect them. Look at the contribution record.
Okay.
Work is almost always collective, right? When someone builds a brag file, the instinct is to inflate. I transformed the department. I led the migration.
Everyone's a CEO on their resume.
Right. But the contribution record forces the worker to systematically tag their exact role. Did you lead the work, coordinate it, support it, maintain it? This mechanical friction guards against inflation. It stops the professional from claiming, I led the migration, when the evidence vault objectively proves they merely supported implementation tracking.
That is an elegant theoretical distinction. I'll give you that. But let's dissect the claim status guide, because I think this completely undermines the disavowal of branding. The LPR requires workers to label the maturity of their claims with specific tags, right? Like proven, verified, supported, emerging, or aspirational.
Yes, to track growth.
But let's say I want to become a director of strategy. That is an aspirational claim. I then spend the next 18 months specifically taking on projects, tagging witnesses, and curating evidence solely to move that claim from aspirational to verified. Categorizing your professional behaviors and mapping them to a future identity you want to inhabit is the mechanical foundation of brand management.
I see the parallel you're drawing, but there's a fundamental difference in the direction of the data flow. Personal branding starts from the outside in. It asks, how do I want the market to perceive me, and then reverse engineers a public persona, often regardless of the underlying reality.
Okay.
The claim status guide works from the inside out. It asks, what can I objectively prove? Yes, you can track an aspirational claim, but you cannot render it to the public as proven until the raw receipts in your evidence vault actually satisfy the governance criteria.
But the end goal is still the market's perception, isn't it?
Not entirely. And the proof of that is in the learning log. The LPR includes a dedicated module that tracks mistakes, lessons learned, and even stale skills you haven't used in 5 years that have basically rusted. A branding engine does not meticulously document its own decay.
Well,
If I'm building a personal brand, I don't keep a highly structured permanent record of the time I crashed a production database, or the fact that my Python coding skills are functionally obsolete. The inclusion of failure, decay, and mistakes anchors this system in objective accountability, not marketing.
honestly, even the documentation of failure is weaponized for future value in this system.
Weaponized? How?
Because the learning log tracks mistakes so that they can eventually support claims of like growth, adaptability, or mature leadership. Nothing in the LPR is allowed to just be a mistake. It must be metabolized and mapped to a future claim of resilience. And look, if we're talking about how this system interacts with others, we have to talk about the witness and feedback layer, because this takes the branding exercise into much darker territory.
Darker territory? That's a bit dramatic.
Absolutely not. The system asks workers to document who saw their work, what exactly they saw, and what specific claim they can support. You're essentially building a private intelligence database on your own colleagues.
Oh, come on.
You are. You are assessing the people sitting next to you based on their utility as future verifiers of your claims. It turns human relationships into highly categorized assets. That isn't just branding, that's bordering on surveillance.
I think that's a highly cynical reading of a feature that is specifically designed to protect people. Let's look at how traditional reference checks work. They are chaotic, they're stressful, and usually vague. You call a former manager and put them on the spot to give a glowing review of 5 years of work from memory. The LPR replaces that with a highly ethical constraint. The rule in the doctrine is, do not ask a witness to verify what they did not observe.
Okay, but how does logging them in a database fix the reference check?
Because it respects their boundaries. Instead of asking a former coworker for a generic, sweeping endorsement, the LPR ensures you only ping them to verify the specific constraint or outcome they were physically in the room for. You can say, hey, can you just verify the before condition of that Q3 rollout? It's granular, it's precise, and it asks way less of the witness. It doesn't turn them into an asset, it frees them from having to be your publicist.
I don't disagree that it is highly systematic and perhaps more ethical than a chaotic phone call. But you cannot deny the structural reality of what you are compiling, which brings us to the core of my dissent, the threat of surveillance. You are building a hyperlinked database of your own professional existence.
But again, the doctrine addresses this head-on. The LPR is not an employer-owned talent file, and it is not a surveillance system. Why? Because of the privacy layer.
Right, the privacy tiers.
Yes, the foundational rule of the entire architecture is that the full record is private by default. The worker has absolute sovereignty over the source layer. The privacy layer travels with every piece of evidence, using labels like shareable with care, summary only, metadata only, or do not upload. How can a system function as a surveillance file if you, the worker, are the only one with the keys, deciding exactly what to redact or exclude entirely?
Because surveillance does not require a hostile external actor if you have internalized the gaze of the observer. Let's look at the decision and judgment log. The text states that this log captures, and I'm quoting directly, decisions made, trade-offs, constraints considered, risks weighed, judgment calls, ethical boundaries, prioritization, and escalation choices.
Which are the most critical components of knowledge work.
They are, but the system is demanding that workers permanently record the most sensitive, ephemeral, and nuanced moments of their internal professional lives. Imagine having a private conversation with a colleague where you decide not to escalate an issue to HR because of a really nuanced ethical boundary. The LPR demands you write that down.
Well, not demands, but encourages.
But writing down your ethical boundaries and escalation choices in a permanent structured file is creating a transparency dossier on yourself. Even if you own it, you have built a panopticon, stepped inside, and turned the camera on yourself.
That's a fascinating philosophical point, but let's look at the practical alternative. Why does the decision and judgment log exist? Because without it, a professional's most valuable contributions literally disappear into thin air. If you manage a crisis or de-escalate a massive compliance risk, the visible output to the company might just be a single closed JIRA ticket or a short email.
True.
The actual value, the brilliance of your work was the judgment you exercised in the shadows.
But does it need to be permanently archived?
Yes, because if you don't document that judgment, you cannot claim ownership of your invisible labor. You become entirely dependent on whatever metrics the company decides to measure you by. Documenting your own judgment is the opposite of surveillance. It is empowerment. Surveillance is done to you to measure you against a corporate metric. The LPR is done by you to ensure your complex human reality isn't erased by a simplistic rendering.
Look, I understand the intention of empowerment. Truly, I do. But we have to look at how this data interacts with the technology designed to process it. We can't talk about the LPR without talking about the AI translation log.
Ah, yes.
The material acknowledges that AI is going to be used to help render, translate, or summarize professional language. But it insists that the AI translation log must track every interaction. It records the source material used, the claims accepted, the claims rejected, and the final approved rendering.
Right, which actually proves my point. The doctrine explicitly states AI assists, the human governs.
But look at the friction. If a worker is feeding this massive, hyper-detailed dossier of decisions, judgments, and ethical constraints into an AI to generate an interview answer, the AI is ingesting that surveillance file. The human may hit approve at the end, but the machine is processing the totality of their professional soul.
But that is exactly why the privacy layer and the AI translation log are integrated. I mentioned the privacy tiers earlier. Let's look at how they actually function. The material explicitly warns, do not upload confidential, proprietary, client-owned, or sensitive material into public tools. If you worked on a highly sensitive merger, you tag it as metadata only in your evidence vault.
Meaning what, practically, for the AI?
Meaning that when you use an AI to help draft a rendering, the AI can see the timeline, the scale of the data, and the complexity, but it never sees the client names or the proprietary strategy. The system is designed to govern the machine. Furthermore, the AI translation log acts as a provenance tracker. Let's say the AI hallucinates.
As they do.
Right. It drafts a bullet point that says you transformed the entire onboarding pipeline when your evidence vault shows you only coordinated manager input. The translation log forces you, the human, to physically reject the inflated claim. It preserves human accountability over machine generation.
I mean, that assumes a level of sustained monastic discipline from the worker that is completely disconnected from human nature. The text admits that the LPR is not a single document. It's a system of relationships. You are connecting evidence to context, context to a claim map, assigning a privacy tier, identifying a witness, and tracking its AI provenance. The administrative overhead required to maintain that chain of custody for every professional action borders on the absurd.
But the material anticipates that exact feeling of overwhelm.
Does it?
It absolutely does. It explicitly notes that a professional can begin with a minimum viable record. It doesn't demand perfection on day one. It demands a shift in architecture. You don't have to map every single email. You start with your biggest projects. Even a partial source layer is infinitely better than relying solely on a stack of disconnected resumes and foggy memories.
I suppose a partial record is better than nothing.
Exactly. Yes, it takes effort. But if you're listening to this, ask yourself, what is the alternative? The alternative is what we have right now, a professional landscape completely plagued by amnesia, invented claims, algorithmic keyword matching, and generic AI-generated corporate noise. The LPR demands discipline because truth requires discipline.
Truth requires discipline. It's a great line, but we must be fiercely honest about the infrastructure we are normalizing here. The living professional record may not technically be an employer dossier today, but by training a generation of workers to meticulously document their trade-offs, map their witnesses, label their claim maturity, and log their AI prompts, we are standardizing a data structure. We are creating the precise anatomical blueprint for the ultimate talent surveillance file.
But the private by default boundary...
The private by default boundary is a policy, not a physical law of nature. And policies change. Once the data exists in this structured, machine-readable format, Evidence linked to context, linked to verified claims. The pressure from platforms, hiring algorithms, and employers to just connect or import your LPR will be immense. The friction of the system practically guarantees that workers will eventually turn to corporate automation to maintain it, surrendering the very governance the system was built to protect.
Well, that is a profound concern, and frankly, it highlights exactly why the distinction between the source layer and the rendering layer is guarded so fiercely in this doctrine. If the boundary holds, if the worker truly retains ownership, privacy, and governance of that source layer, then the living professional record represents a massive paradigm shift. It moves us away from a world where professionals are defined by how well they game an algorithm and towards a world anchored in evidence, context, and verifiable reality.
I will certainly agree that it is a paradigm shift. Moving from a messy desktop folder of disconnected work samples to a unified, governed system of professional memory is a monumental leap. I just remain highly skeptical that a system demanding such forensic, exhaustive tracking of one's own internal judgments can escape functioning as a branding machine and a self-surveillance engine. The architecture may be conceptually brilliant, but we cannot ignore the profound psychological shift it demands. You are no longer just doing the work. You are simultaneously serving as the archivist, the auditor, and the compliance officer of your own career.
And perhaps that level of extreme ownership is exactly what is required to survive in an increasingly complex, AI-saturated professional landscape. We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the profound implications of what the living professional record is, and crucially, what it refuses to be. We've seen how its strict architectural separation aims to protect truth and privacy, even as it demands rigorous, sometimes exhausting governance from the worker.
There is certainly more to explore in the source material. Whether this system successfully delivers on its promises or inevitably collapses under the weight of its own administrative demands is a question that will likely be answered not by the doctrine, but by the professionals attempting to build these records in the wild.
Exactly right. As always, we leave the final judgment open for you to consider. So, as you reflect on your own professional surfaces, your resumes, your profiles, your portfolios, ask yourself, are you just staring at the stage lighting, or is it time to start building the rigging beneath the floorboards?
Just don't get lost in the dark down there.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the living professional record. Until next time.